Okay, so this is part two of the this set of slides over here. So in the previous part, we kind of went over the idea of a distribution of data, right? So a distribution of data tells us, what values occur for that data, which values are more common, which values are less common, and then we've talked about probability density functions, right? Where under some circumstances, we could use a mathematical function called a probability density function to approximate the histogram of our data. And then we use the areas, right, associated with the probability density function to evaluate corresponding probabilities and proportions. Um, so what I'm going to do in this part over here is just go over some other terminology and some basic concepts that we will see a lot in statistics. Right. So the underlying motivation is this idea, right? So in many studies, what happens is that we want answers to questions regarding a population of interest, right? So for example, if our question of interest is, what's the average annual income of American adults? Now, ideally, we'd like to be able to obtain the data from every single American adult. However, due to constraints such as time and money, right, we are unable to obtain the data from every single American adult. So what statisticians typically will say, well, then why don't we then collect a data from a random sample of American adults and then use the characteristics of the sample, right, to estimate the characteristics of the population. So that's basically what a lot of these the things that we do in statistical analysis, um, right? It relates to this idea that we use a sample, calculate information on the sample, and then use that characteristics of the sample to estimate the characteristics in the population. So these are just some general definitions, right? So population is the group of all items of interest in our study. So in the previous example about average annual income of all Americans, right? The group of interest, the population would be all Americans or all working Americans. The sample are the items from which we actually collect data on, right? So the sample, right, ideally should be a random sample. So if you have a random sample, then it will be viewed as a representative sample of the population. And typically, right, we want this to be a pretty large sample. Um, right, so this group is, right, the group from which we actually collect data on because we can't get data from every single item in the population. Right, so let's take a look at this example, right? So a manufacturing company produces 5 million parts. To estimate the proportion of parts that are defective, we randomly select 300 parts and carefully inspect these 300 parts for defects, right? So what's the population of interest? What's the sample over here? So I'm going to pause here a little bit. Right, so the population of interest would be the 5 million parts, right? But due to maybe time constraints, you're unable to carefully inspect all of them. So the sample here would be the 300 parts that are randomly selected, and actually you get data from these 300, right? So you don't get data from all 5 million over here. Now, some of the terms, right? So we have what we call a parameter. A parameter is a number describing a characteristic of the population. So the average annual income, right, of the population of American adults. Right, so the average income, whatever that numerical value is, that's a parameter. Now, key things to take note: parameters are fixed values because there's only one population of interest. But in practice, we do not know the numerical values associated with parameters. A statistic is a number describing a characteristic of a sample, right? So a statistic could be the average income in your random sample of American adults. So this statistics are values that we can actually calculate and quantify, right? The other thing to take note of, though, that while parameters are fixed values, statistics vary from sample to sample, right? Because I take a random sample of 500 adults, find their sample mean. I take another random sample of 500 adults. The sample mean is probably going to be a little bit different, right? It probably will be close to each other, but right, they're not going to be exactly equal to another. So how do we then use the statistic, right, to estimate our unknown parameter? Right, it's unlikely to be exactly the same, but it's probably going to be pretty close. Right, so if you think about what I just described, right, this is where distributions will come in, right? Because each time we take a random sample and calculate, say, the sample mean varies a little bit. And so if we keep collecting all those sample means and then create a histogram, right, one could potentially use a density function, right, a probability density function to estimate that that histogram. So each time we take a random sample from a population, we're likely to get a different set of individuals, and we calculate a different statistic, right? There is variability in the statistics. So let me just maybe draw this out a little bit more, right? So you have your first sample, and then you find a sample mean. So I'm going to put x bar in the subscript 1 to represent it from this first sample, and maybe this is a value, right? And we were talking about average income, right, for American adults. So maybe this group will say 40,375, right? And then we take another random sample, all of the same size, right? So let's say all these random samples were samples of size 500. This other group, maybe 43,894, right? And then you have a third sample, and then you have a sample mean, and this is calculated as 45,689, right? And then you keep repeating this until you get many, many different samples. Well, if you look at all these different sample means, they vary. You then create a histogram of the sample means, right? And then do we have a PDF, right, which we usually denote by f of x, that can describe or can approximate this histogram? So that's what we are trying to do over here, right? So question is, can we quantify this variability without having to obtain many different random samples, right? So if you think about this exercise over here, it's a bit tedious to keep getting many different random samples of size 500. So is there statistical theory that will allow us to actually describe the variability and the distribution of the sample means without having the need to collect all these different random samples? And obviously the answer is yes. Right, if we take lots of random samples of the same size from a population, the distribution of the sample statistics, right, which is called the sampling distribution. The sampling distribution refers to the distribution of the sample statistics. So far I've talked about the distribution of the sample mean. We could also talk about the distribution of the sample median, so on and so forth, whichever one you want. The sampling distribution, under some circumstances, can follow a predictable shape or predictable distribution. So under some circumstances, the sampling distribution can be well approximated by a specific distribution and its PDF, right? So what this tells us is we don't have to do this exercise to keep getting all the random samples. We know from some statistical theory that these sampling distributions can be described by a specific distribution, and we can find probabilities very easily. Now, generally speaking, right, the variance or standard deviation, so as a quick recollection, right, variance is basically the standard deviation squared, right? Generally decrease as the sample size increases. So variance measures how spread out your statistics are. So basically it's saying, right, if you get larger sample sizes, then your sample statistics, like your sample means, will get closer and closer to each other on average. Okay, so we've kind of gone over very fundamental ideas. The next part will go over specifically, right, what is this specific distribution for the sample means, and we will be looking specifically at sample means in the next part.